What's up? Today we're gonna cover the top 5 opening traps against white's first move pawn to d4, and these are my favorite ones. They are unknown and highly effective, so let's get right into it. Alright, so the first one happens after we go into the queen's gambit. Here white offers this gambit pawn, and what I suggest you do is just to accept it. Now, a lot of your opponents will play here the move pawn to e3, aiming to get this pawn back. On top of that, lots of your opponents are aware of the most classical trap in the Queen's Gambit. So first of all, let me show you what your opponents are hoping for, and then let me show you how we are going to turn that around. Your opponent is expecting you to play pawn to b5, and after that white goes pawn a4, trying to split up these pawns, and as you try to keep it up, here is the very classical trap that wins the game for white. Black cannot defend their rook without losing material, and white wins. Now let me show you what we have prepared instead. In this position, after your opponent attacks your pawn, instead of going pawn to b5, you're going to defend it with your bishop. And that creates a pretty strong question for your opponent. How is he going to get it back? Moreover, right now you are ready to play b5 if necessary to overprotect this pawn on c4. So I mean, queen f3 will never be an issue because at least you can go bishop d5, and there are a lot of ways for you to handle that. So pawn on c4 is not that easy for white to get it back. So lots of your opponents will figure out that they can deliver a check to your king, and on the next move, they can get the pawn back with the support of the queen from a4. And after that, you play pawn to c6, and here I can't help but to show you something really funny. Here we can see the stats in the lower right corner, and you can see that the most played move by far is bishop takes c4, which is actually a big blunder, because instead of trading bishops, you've got something a lot better. You're gonna play pawn to b5, which is a simple double attack to these two pieces, and white can't save them. But the fun doesn't stop here. In most cases, white tries to get at least some pawns for their bishop, so they trade on b5, you play bishop d7 to carry your king, and just look at this, the most played move here by white is queen to b7. I mean, by now black's position is already winning, you're up a piece, but they desperately try to find back, and they play queen b7, which makes it completely lost, because now you've got bishop to c6, double attack to the queen, and this time this pawn on g2. So if the queen drops back somewhere, you grab this pawn on g2, and on the next move you inevitably grab the rook, and that's how you completely devastate white. There's another common trap for your opponents to fall for. Here, if they notice that the issue is actually around this bishop, right, which protects the pawn, they may decide to play knight to f3, going after this bishop with knight to g5 on the next move. So what you do here is you play pawn to c6, kind of pretending like you're preparing to play b5 and make this pawn chain, which is actually one of your ideas, and it's a pretty good thing for black to do anyway. But if white continues with their plan and goes knight to g5, this time it fails to queen a5. Notice that it's very handy for us to have this pawn on c6 so that it gives way to the queen to go there, and this time it's double attack to the king and the knight, therefore winning the knight on the next move. The next one is a lot of fun. Remember the trap your opponent was trying to get you into? We're going to use that against him. So after white goes pawn to d4, instead of going for the classical queen's gambit, you offer the pawn right away. Your opponent may take it, because why not? Then you play pawn e6, aiming to get the pawn back. Here your opponent may realize that he can go pawn to b4 and pretend this pawn, and also this makes it harder for you to move around, to develop, to move something, so b4 looks really strong for white. Then you play pawn to a5. At this point your opponent starts thinking what to do. If white splits up the pawns, then you can pick them up very easily, and you actually get some positional advantage. That's cool. What else can your opponent play here? Pawn a3 fails to another tactics. After you trade here pawns on b4, notice that this drops the rook on a1 for white. And that's how you can win games against some less experienced opponents. If you're facing somebody stronger, they will probably calculate this line, and they'll figure out that they gotta defend this pawn differently by playing pawn to c3. And here after an exchange, at first looks like white is just dominating with an extra pawn, but then you play this tricky move queen f6. It's quite an unusual tactics, because rarely you win a game by playing queen f6, but here it is exactly the case. So white is gonna lose the rook, or at least they'll have to give up the knight to cover that, and in any case you're getting a totally winning position. So what's really funny about this variation is that this trap is very known with reversed colors, but somehow when you use it as black, not as white, your opponents are completely clueless about it. By the way, all the opening traps I'm sharing with you are actually decent opening lines, meaning that if your opponent does not fall for the trap, you continue playing as if nothing happened because you are actually having a good position anyway. So against d4, another thing that I recommend is you going for this b6 opening. One of my favorite ones, I played myself a lot in Blitz. So after c4, bishop to b7, your opponent will usually go knight to c3 because that's how they play in the Queen's Indian defense or any other similar openings. And then they aim to play pawn to e4, and grab the center, but you allow them to do so. So okay, you can just go pawn e6, and your opponent so far thinks that you're playing some passive weird moves. Oh, he happily plays e4, grabbing the center. Looks like he's totally in control, but that's when you start your brutal counterattack. So first you play bishop b4, and you say, hey, you've got these overextended pawns, and now I'm going to target them. What you do with bishop to b4 is that you pin this knight down to the king, therefore it can no longer move, and on the next move you threaten to capture this pawn on e4. If your opponent notices this, and by the way, many of them will just miss that completely and will blunder the central pawn, but even if they notice and play bishop d3, here you confuse them once again with the move pawn to f5, striking in the center once again. And this is getting quite uncomfortable for white because they see that you are putting pressure in the center of the board. You're also ready to develop knights to increase pressure to these central pawns one way or the other, with the other knight. So it's quite complicated for white to figure out the right way here. And if they capture this pawn on f5 thinking that you're just playing weird opening, then this is actually losing because of bishop takes g2, and whoops, there's no way to defend this rook in the corner. They can throw this check, queen h5, but that doesn't change anything after king to f8. They have no attack whatsoever. You're going to go knight to f6, chase this queen away, and anyway they can't defend their rook, so you're going to grab it on the next move and win the game. By the way, I've got another video where I cover this particular opening variation in greater detail, so if you're interested, you can click the link in the description below the video and check it out later. Here's one more sudden but highly effective thing that you can do. You use the two knights game against your opponent who's playing d4. And usually the two knights game is used against d4, but here you're using it against d4. So you play knight f6, and after c4, knight c6. You're developing both of your knights, which are perfectly fine moves, you gotta develop anyway. Your opponent will usually continue as they usually do in the queen's gambit, so they play knight c3, and here you strike in the center with the move pawn to e5. And here comes something unusual, because mostly in the queen's gambit, black goes pawn d5 at some point, but here you attack white center the other way. And if they trade, no problem, your knight is getting even more active, you're having an excellent position there. So in most cases they're trying to attack you somehow, so they play d5, go knight e7, and on the next move you reroute your knight to g6, which is actually an excellent square for the knight, because in the future, it can jump to f4 later in the middle game and help you to attack. So that's an excellent square for the knight anyway. Here they usually play bishop d3, they still want to be protective and support their center. You play this bishop out to c5, it kind of looks like both sides are just developing their pieces, and in this position the most played move by white is knight e2, which is already a losing error. So that allows you to go knight to g4 and attack this pawn on f2 twice. Therefore you're threatening either to capture it with the bishop and attack his king, or to grab it with the knight and fork the king, the rook, the bishop, and everything. Still, at this point they may still feel comfortable because they think, oh, I was going to castle anyway. So they castle, thinking their life is good, but here after queen to h4 you add one more attack to f2 square, but on top of that you're now threatening queen takes f2 checkmate, and white's position simply falls apart. So they have to prevent this checkmate by playing pawn to h3. And here comes knight takes f2, attacking the queen, the bishop, preparing all kinds of discovered checks along this diagonal, so they have to give up material, then you're grabbing the rook, and after king to h1, not only you're up material, but you save your very strong attack against white's king. You can play pawn d6, opening up this bishop, and you can even sack it over there on h3. You can go knight h4 and threaten, queen takes g2 checkmate. This bishop is extremely strong, so, it's completely dominant for black and should be winning within a couple moves. By the way, let me also share one general positional principle which is useful for this or any other chess opening. You can see that white went down after he played knight to e2. And there's a general positional principle which says that normally you gotta develop pieces to most forward available squares. Therefore, in this position, knight f3 would be a correct move for white. It's not that it's winning the game, it's just a normal game of chess after that. But knight e2 was losing the game on the spot. You see that regardless of whether you know an opening theory or not, if you know those general positional principles, it's pretty easy to follow them. If you want to know more about that, I have a free masterclass where I cover those positional principles. You can click the link in the description below and check it out. And the final trap for today looks a bit weird at first, but for some strange reason it actually works. It's the move pawn to b5. And what it does at first is at least you prevent your opponent from playing his intended move pawn to c4. Of course, b5 still looks weird, and white can grab the center this way by going pawn e4, and that also hits this pawn on b5. But you can ignore that and go knight f6, counter-attacking this pawn. At this point, your opponent will probably realize that yes, they can trade pawns, but that's just an exchange, but they can push the pawn to e5 first, attack your knight, and only after that they can win this pawn on b5 for nothing. So for now, they're thinking that they're playing a dummy, and you're just throwing out random moves, and white is already almost winning. Then you play pawn to c5, kind of pretending like you sack yet another pawn. And strangely enough, this position is pretty difficult for white to play. I mean, of course, Stockfish that calculates millions of variations can handle it, but for a human being, realizing what's going on here is actually extremely complicated. Yes, you gave up a pawn, but that's not such a big deal. Now you start counterattacking these overextended pawns, and white's got to figure out how to, solve that problem. Moreover, there is also another tactical trick that they usually overlook. If they play pawn takes c5, thinking that that also attacks your knight on d5 and grabs yet another pawn, you play queen a5. And all of a sudden, white realizes that, hey, that's a double attack. So this queen a5 trick is very powerful in these variations. And now, in most cases, they just go knight c3. That's the most played move in this position, and it's completely bad, because knight c3 does not really defend this bishop, as you can trade knights first, and after that you can grab the bishop, and now also white's pawn structures is completely ruined, and you're up a piece. So that's completely bad. But even if your opponent is more advanced, let's get it back, and realizes that, hey, I was actually attacking these knights, so let's just trade. And he plays something like pawn to c3, saying, okay, you grab a bishop, I grab your knight. Then you follow along this line, and here after bishop b7 it turns out that you still outsmarted your opponent, because the queen now has to move, and after it moves somewhere, doesn't really matter, you then grab this pawn on g2 and still win this rook on h1. Somehow it's a common tactical pattern because it works across different opening traps that we discussed today. Moreover, besides bishop takes h1, which is already winning, you also have the sudden threat of queen to f1. Quite an unusual invasion which can also win the game. So you're just completely winning once again. So far we've been talking about traps for black against d4, but if you want to know traps for white in the Queen's Gambit, I've got another video about that. It got almost 2 million views already, so people are really enjoying it, and I hope that you will enjoy it just as well. Take care, I'll talk to you soon.